connect you.
The official account seemed clear. Nolan Wells never made it back onto the boat. For weeks, that explanation shaped nearly every discussion surrounding this case. But then investigators released a piece of evidence that changed everything. The emergency call made as the group was leaving Horn Island. At first, it sounded like exactly what you'd expect. A panicked call from a group of teenagers reporting that their boat was taking on water. But the more people listened, the more questions surfaced. Some listeners believe the background audio contains voices calling Nolan's name. Others believe they hear someone ask if a person is dead before another voice tells someone named Wyatt to check his chest. Those interpretations have not been confirmed by investigators, and different people hear different things. Still, the recording has become one of the most heavily scrutinized pieces of evidence in the entire case. Then came the GPS data. Investigators downloaded the navigation records directly from the boats involved, creating a minute-by-minute timeline of where they traveled after leaving Horn Island. When those records are placed alongside public statements made after Nolan disappeared, the timeline becomes far more complicated than many people first believed. Tonight, we're breaking down the emergency call, the official GPS records, and the questions they raise, not to reach conclusions, but to separate verified facts from interpretation, and understand why this investigation continues to draw such intense public attention. Before we continue, let us know your thoughts in the comments. What stands out to you most about this case? And if you enjoy detailed true crime documentaries, subscribe to Midnight True Crime for more stories like this. On July 4th, as the group prepared to leave Horn Island, something went wrong. Just after departing the island, an emergency call was placed to a marine assistance service. The caller reported that the boat's bilge pump had stopped working and that water was rapidly filling the vessel. His voice sounded rushed. At several points, he struggled to answer basic questions as the dispatcher tried to understand exactly what was happening. The dispatcher asked how much water was inside the boat. The response was simple: "We're going down." The caller explained that the group believed the boat was sinking and urgently requested help. He provided the vessel's location near Horn Island and asked if someone could come tow the boat back to shore. The dispatcher also asked whether the United States Coast Guard needed to be notified. The answer was immediate: "No, we do not need that." At the time, that response may not have seemed unusual. Young people dealing with a mechanical problem might naturally hope they could solve it without involving emergency responders. But as more information became public, that exchange began attracting far more attention. Throughout the call, the dispatcher repeatedly tried to gather basic information. How many people were on board? Were they wearing life jackets? What type of boat was it? At one point, confusion over a simple question led to an awkward exchange. When asked how many adults were on board, the caller initially responded that there were 0 adults, explaining that no one aboard was over the age of 21. The dispatcher had to clarify that she simply wanted to know how many living people were on the vessel. Eventually, the caller answered that there were approximately 7 people on board. For investigators, those details helped establish who was believed to be present during the return trip from Horn Island. But it wasn't the conversation with the dispatcher that would later dominate public discussion. It was everything happening behind it. As the recording spread online, thousands of people began listening beyond the caller's voice. Some listeners believe they hear someone repeatedly calling Nolan's name somewhere in the background. Others believe they hear what sounds like someone asking whether a person is dead before another voice appears to tell someone named Wyatt to check his chest. It's important to emphasize that these interpretations have not been confirmed by investigators. The quality of the audio makes it difficult to determine exactly what is being said, and different listeners have reached different conclusions after hearing the recording. Even so, the emergency call quickly became one of the most closely analyzed pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Not because it answered the case, but because it raised new questions. If the publicly understood timeline was accurate, Why did so many people believe they were hearing something completely different? And perhaps more importantly, would the official GPS records support that timeline or challenge it? The emergency call wasn't the only piece of evidence investigators examined. In the days following Nolan Wells' disappearance, officers with the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources obtained permission to examine the electronic navigation systems installed on the boats involved in the trip. Modern marine GPS systems record far more than a destination. Depending on the equipment, they can preserve routes, travel speeds, timestamps, waypoints, and movement history. In an investigation like this, that information can become invaluable because, unlike witness recollections, digital records cannot forget details or confuse the sequence of events. According to official records, investigators downloaded navigation data from 2 separate vessels connected to the case. The files were copied directly from the onboard Garmin chart plotters before being converted into formats that allowed investigators to reconstruct the boat's movements using satellite imagery. That process produced a detailed timeline of the trip on July 4th. The records indicate that the boat carrying Nolan and the others departed for Horn Island shortly before 10 o'clock that morning. The vessel arrived at the island just over an hour later, where it remained stationary for several hours while the group spent the afternoon on the island. According to the GPS data, there was nothing unusual about this portion of the trip. The recorded movements were consistent with a boat that had remained in one location. The timeline changes later that afternoon. At approximately 4:30 p.m., the GPS records show the boat leaving the western end of Horn Island. Almost immediately, its speed dropped dramatically. Instead of traveling at the higher speeds normally expected during a return trip, the vessel moved slowly for several miles. That period aligns with the emergency call in which the caller reported that the bilge pump had failed and that the boat was taking on water. The GPS data and the distress call appear to describe the same stretch of the journey. Then something changed. According to the GPS records, the boat resumed normal operating speed. From that point onward, the vessel traveled back toward the mainland without the prolonged, slow movement seen immediately after leaving Horn Island. The available records indicate that whatever mechanical issue the occupants believed they were experiencing was no longer preventing the boat from traveling at normal speed. For investigators, this sequence helps establish an important fact. The reported mechanical problem appears to have been temporary. That observation becomes significant because, during the emergency call, marine assistance was requested, yet before any rescue vessel reached the group, those plans changed. A local captain later stated that he had spoken with the boat's owner and was told assistance was no longer needed. As a result, no emergency response was dispatched to meet the vessel on the water. Exactly how the situation was resolved while the boat remained offshore has become one of several questions discussed publicly since the records were released. The GPS data answers where the boat traveled. It does not answer everything that happened aboard the vessel during that journey, and that distinction is important. Digital evidence can establish movements, locations, and timing. It cannot by itself explain every decision made by the people on board. That is why investigators consider GPS records alongside witness statements, interviews, and other evidence when reconstructing a timeline. As the route continued back toward the mainland, the GPS history documented something else that would later receive significant public attention. It wasn't simply where the boat went, it was where it went next. As investigators continued analyzing the GPS data, attention shifted away from the emergency call and toward what happened after the boat reached the mainland. The navigation records provide a minute-by-minute reconstruction of the vessel's movements. While they cannot explain what happened on board, they do establish where the boat traveled and when. According to the GPS timeline, the vessel returned to the mainland at approximately 5:44 p.m., arriving at a residence on El Camino Real Road. Investigators later identified this location as the home associated with one of the individuals connected to the trip. On its own, returning to the residence was not unusual. What drew attention was what happened next. Rather than remaining there for the rest of the evening, the GPS records indicate that the boat left again only minutes later. At approximately 5:52 p.m., it departed the residence and traveled east toward Fort Bayou, before eventually returning once more. Later that evening, the vessel left yet again, traveling through Biloxi Bay before ultimately arriving at the Fort Bayou boat launch. From there, it was transported to another residence, where the GPS history came to an end. Those additional movements have become an important part of the public discussion surrounding the case. Not because they prove that a crime occurred, but because investigators routinely examine every movement made before, during, and after a critical incident. Understanding where a vehicle, or in this case a boat, traveled can help establish a reliable timeline against which witness statements and other evidence can be compared. As the GPS records became public, attention turned to interviews given after Nolan's disappearance. In one public account, it was explained that after returning from the island, the group made a stop related to the reported mechanical issue with the boat, before continuing with the rest of the evening's plans. The GPS records confirm that the boat made additional trips after arriving back on the mainland. However, as with many investigations, the digital evidence documents the route. It does not explain the reasons behind every stop. That distinction is critical. A GPS track can show investigators where a vessel traveled. It cannot tell them why the people aboard chose a particular destination, what conversations took place, or what decisions were made during those stops. Those questions require investigators to examine interviews, physical evidence, digital records, forensic findings, and witness statements together. This is why timelines matter so much in criminal investigations. Every movement can either support an account or reveal areas that require further examination. The timeline created from the Garmin data does not answer every question in Nolan Wells's case. What it does provide is an objective sequence of movements, one that investigators can compare with every other piece of evidence collected throughout the investigation. And that brings us back to the emergency call. Because when the call, the GPS records, and later public statements are placed side by side, investigators, and the public, begin asking the same question. Do these pieces of evidence fit together as one consistent timeline? Or are there still gaps that have yet to be fully explained? Those are questions that only a complete investigation can answer. But there is one more aspect of the emergency call that continues to generate intense debate. It isn't what the caller said to the dispatcher. It's what some people believe they heard behind the caller's voice. Long before the GPS records were released, the emergency call had already become one of the most closely analyzed pieces of evidence in the case. Not because of what was said between the caller and the dispatcher, but because of what some people believe can be heard in the background. When the recording first became public, many listeners focused on the caller's description of a boat taking on water. Others, however, replayed the audio repeatedly, paying close attention to the voices behind the conversation. Almost immediately, clips of the recording began circulating online. People slowed the audio down. They increased the volume. Some filtered out background noise in an attempt to make individual voices easier to hear. As often happens with recordings of this nature, listeners reached very different conclusions. Some believe they can hear people repeatedly calling Nolan's name. Others believe they hear someone asking whether a person is dead, followed by another voice telling someone named Wyatt to check his chest. Those interpretations have spread widely across social media. However, it is important to emphasize one critical point. Investigators have not publicly confirmed that those words are present in the recording. Audio recordings captured during emergency situations are often difficult to interpret. Wind, engine noise, overlapping conversations, poor phone reception, and compression can all affect what listeners think they hear. It's not uncommon for different people to hear completely different phrases in the very same recording. For investigators, that means the recording cannot be evaluated based solely on public opinion. Instead, it must be examined alongside every other piece of evidence collected during the investigation. That includes witness interviews, physical evidence, digital records, phone data, GPS information, and forensic findings. No single piece of evidence should ever be viewed in isolation. Even so, the public reaction to the recording illustrates just how much attention this case continues to receive. Many people believe the background voices raise important questions. Others caution against drawing conclusions from an audio clip that has not been officially interpreted by investigators. Both perspectives highlight the same reality. The recording has become a focal point of the investigation because people are searching for answers that have not yet been fully explained. As investigators continue reviewing the evidence, the emergency call remains just one part of a much larger picture. The GPS records establish where the boat traveled. The emergency call documents a reported mechanical emergency. Witness statements provide individual accounts of what happened that day. The challenge for investigators is determining how all of those pieces fit together. That process takes time. It requires comparing every statement against the available evidence, identifying any inconsistencies, and determining whether those inconsistencies have innocent explanations or require further investigation. Cases like this are rarely solved by one dramatic discovery. More often, investigators build the timeline piece by piece, testing every fact against the evidence until they can establish what happened with confidence. For Nolan Wells' family, however, every new record released to the public carries enormous significance. Each document, each interview, each recording, each new timeline represents another opportunity to better understand what happened on July 4th. And while the emergency call has generated intense public discussion, it is only one chapter in an investigation that is still unfolding. The ultimate answers will depend not on speculation, but on where the evidence leads. The release of the emergency call and the GPS records has undeniably changed the public conversation surrounding Nolan Wells' case. Before these records became available, much of what people knew came from interviews, recollections, and public statements. Now, investigators and the public have additional evidence that helps establish part of the timeline. The emergency call documents a reported mechanical emergency as the group left Horn Island. The GPS records reconstruct the boat's movements before and after that call. Together, those records provide investigators with objective data that can be compared against witness interviews, digital evidence, forensic findings, and every other piece of information collected throughout the investigation. What they do not do is answer every question. The GPS data can show where a boat traveled. It cannot explain every decision made by the people aboard. The emergency call captures only a few minutes of an entire day. It does not document everything that happened before the call or everything that happened after it ended. That is why investigators continue to examine every piece of evidence as part of a much larger picture. As with any active investigation, apparent inconsistencies do not automatically indicate wrongdoing. Sometimes they can be explained by incomplete information, imperfect memory, or evidence that has not yet been made public. Other times, they lead investigators toward new questions that require further examination. For Nolan's family, however, every new record represents another chance to move closer to the truth. Like countless families waiting for answers, they have continued to ask investigators to follow every lead, review every document, and account for every moment of Nolan's final known timeline. Whether the emergency call ultimately proves to be a turning point in the investigation remains to be seen. Whether the GPS records resolve existing questions or create new ones is something only investigators can determine as the case progresses. But one fact remains unchanged. An 18-year-old left for what was supposed to be a day on the water with friends. He never returned home. That is the tragedy at the center of this case. The documents, recordings, interviews, and timelines all serve one purpose: helping investigators determine exactly what happened and providing Nolan's loved ones with the answers they have been searching for. As additional records are released and the investigation continues, we will continue following every verified development, separating confirmed facts from speculation, and bringing you the latest information as it becomes available. If you found this breakdown informative, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Which piece of evidence do you believe investigators should examine most closely moving forward? As always, please keep the discussion respectful. Every case involves real people whose lives have been permanently changed. If you found this documentary informative, subscribe to Midnight True Crime and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We cover the facts, follow the evidence, and bring you the latest developments in the cases that matter most. And before you go, we'd like to hear from you. What do you think is the biggest unanswered question in the Nolan Wells investigation? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, please keep the discussion respectful. The headlines may fade, but the search for truth never ends. This is Midnight True Crime. We'll see you in the next investigation.